So thank you everyone for hanging around. And a handful of tactics against representation of the artistic and the political kind. So I'm going to just go through 11 tactics that have been useful. Can you hear well with this? Yeah? That have been useful for the kind of work I've been doing and the collectives I work with have been doing. So I was trained in theatre and then I was trained in fine art. Now theatre was a great training because it taught me some terrible things. It taught me that art and life should be separate. That especially, it's really good that there's a stage that separates the experts from the audience. And whatever happens, even if the world is falling around, the audience must stay in their seats. So it taught me a lot of things about the culture of separation we have. This idea that we separate everything in capitalism. Tourists go on big boats into the Arctic and they watch the glaciers melt. So we're living in a culture of exponential curves. And every day I watch the curves kind of go up. So whether they're curves that talk about global temperature, or whether they're curves that talk about the depletion of the soil, or whether they're curves that talk about the depletion of water, or the acidification of the seas, or the gap between rich and poor, they keep going up, and up, and up. And we all know that what happens at the end of an exponential curve, it always crashes. So above where I work in London, I have this postcard that was produced in a collective I worked with in the 1980s. And it says, the question of art is no longer one of aesthetics, but the survival of the planet. So what is aesthetics? Well, aesthetics, for me, it comes from the Greek. It means aesthesis. It means to sense the world, to feel it, to literally feel it in your stomach, to actually understand and feel the world with your gut. When I was 14, my father died of skin cancer, and being a 14-year-old boy, I didn't really want to feel anything. So my mother was like, you need to, how are you feeling? You need to talk to someone, I wouldn't talk to anyone, and eventually she took me to the doctor, because, it's good to see an expert in those situations. So they took me to the doctor, and I sat opposite the doctor on a desk, and the doctor said, so John, how are you feeling? So I opened my mouth and I projectile vomited across his oak desk. And I sometimes wish I could still feel like that. So when I was a bit older, I did art college and I got into performance art and I got into body art. And so I did all the things that body artists do. I took my clothes off. I cut myself, I did all those things, thinking that I was making radical art. And I was doing it in galleries, and then I thought, no, it's not radical enough. I may have to go and do it outside. So I started to do the same things in the street, thinking, I'm in the public space now, it's definitely radical art. Trouble is, everyone didn't think it was art at all. They thought I was simply mad. And even if they did kind of begin to think it was art, they would just talk about the fact that it wasn't art, and we'd have a discussion about what is art and what isn't art, which was not what I was interested in. I was interested in making art that somehow talked about society, about change. So this taught me the first tactic, which for me is called the invisibility trick. So Jean Dubuffet wrote, "Art loves to be incognito. Its best moments are when it forgets what it is called." And I soon realized that actually art gets in the way. Very often it gets in the way of what you want to talk about, of what you want to create, of what you want to really do. And so I started to make the art invisible. So in the 90s, I was doing a lot of projects where actually it was completely invisible that it was art. So this was a project on a buried river, an urban buried river, where there were 75 buried rivers in London. And so we set up a fake development agency to dig up the river, to say we're going to go and dig up the river and this is what it's going to look like, and we worked with architects to create models of what the river would look like, and we pretended we were an urban development agency. No one knew it was art, and the story really started to spread in the media and so on in the area. And then I did other projects. I did a whole series of projects about men's relationship to, or heterosexual men's relationship to pornography. This is me a long time ago, without Photoshop. I did a whole project where, for example, I set up a fake sex shop in a town centre which again was invisible as art. So all these tactics, and I haven't got time to talk about them now, but all these tactics were really about making art invisible. Trying to do the same process, but making the art invisible. Because for me, art isn't a noun, it's not a thing, it's a verb. It's a way of doing something. It's much more about the process and the behaviour and that we apply to something. So then, when I was about, in 1993, I had my life changed. And I jumped over a wall during a protest against a urban motorway that was going to knock down 350 houses, destroy 3 woodlands, just to have, say, 7 minutes on a car journey. Of course, once the road was built, those 7 minutes weren't even saved because the traffic had increased, because it took 40 years to plan and build the road. So there was loads of protest against it, and one of the protests was direct action. And for me, this was the first time I'd taken direct action. I jumped over a wall, and I jumped onto a bulldozer, and I stopped the bulldozer with people, and I suddenly thought, hang on, this is really similar to the performance art that I used to be interested in. You know, these are people's bodies, in public space, taking action with an element of risk, but actually it's really real. It's really pragmatic. It's stopping the bulldozers, and it's costing the government money, and in the end, that movement in England cancelled about 700 road schemes. So for me, it was the best kind of theatre. In a way, it was theatre which had budgets much better than the Royal Opera House, in fact. Because the Royal Opera House could never afford policemen on horses, a whole forest. And so for me, I suddenly realised this was much more interesting theatre. And it was beautiful. I mean, really, there were many tree houses and so on, and really there was an incredible poetry to a lot of the stuff. The trouble is, in many ways, by getting involved in the direct action movements, and that's what I did, I basically threw myself into the direct action movements and started to work within them. I did what Susie Gavlik, who is a cultural theorist, she calls the art world the prison of the art world. So I did manage to escape the prison of the art world, but I did spend a bit more time in the cells of the prisons of the real world. This is me being arrested as a clown. When they arrested me, they actually said I was a 22-year-old female, which was great because I was 44. And when you disobey in the art world, in a sense, you get you're celebrated. You get onto the front of the art magazines, you get to go to biennales, you've changed the form. When you disobey in the real world, it's a very different matter. You end up getting police records, being followed. It's a very, very different situation. This is the front page of The Guardian recently. This is me here, as a domestic extremist, which I think is really unfair, because I'm very bad at ironing. It didn't go, that joke. It's an English joke. Okay. Domestic extremism, ironing. No. Never mind. But the thing is that in a way, the difference between the art world and the social movement for me is the element of solidarity. So here, I might be here, but I'm actually surrounded by my friends here, and friends who basically are all incredibly creative, but would never call themselves artists. They all put all their passion and all their creativity into social movements, but never would want to call themselves artists. So that's the invisibility tactic. The second tactic, give up representation. So I think the art world is obsessed by representation. It's an illness. And they find it really hard to shake off. For me, what I learned from direct action was that direct action was actually about taking action that directly changed the thing you wanted to change. It wasn't about asking someone and writing a letter to a politician, making a demonstration saying, we want this. It was going and doing it, like squatting the Gängeviertel. It was going to do the thing you want to do directly, to make the change directly. So for me, art, the best art, was surely doing the same. Surely the role of art was to transform the world, not to represent it. I didn't want to make pictures of politics. I wanted to actually change the world. Now, most artists who get involved in social movements end up kind of designing flyers and doing the propaganda and the communications, which is fine. And I've done that too. This is something I recently did for the climate camp in London. But really, for me, that's not the key. I think artists have a lot more to give to social movements than just designing their posters. I think there is an incredible creativity that is necessary within social movements. Because the trouble is, most social movements, most politics, to be honest, is pretty boring. You know, it's like marching from A to B with a placard which says no. It's newspapers, it's long, long consensus meetings. It's really, really dull. But what's in that space is courage. It's people who really have the courage to break the law, the courage to actually put their bodies on the line, and they don't have the egos that the artists have. And for me, that's why the space that is most interesting to create is to create a space where the imagination of the artist and the courage and the social critique of the activists come together. Because in the end, I think the challenge is we have to make radical social movements as sexy as capitalism. And that's not easy. Stephen Duncan wrote in a book, a great book called Dream, Reimagining Progressive Politics in an Age of Fantasies. And he wrote, politics is not solely or even primarily about reasoned thinking and rational choices. It's an affair of fantasy and design. People are rarely moved to action, support, or even consent by realistic proposals. They're motivated by dreams of what could be. Dreams of what could be. How do you make politics about the dreams of what could be? So we come to tactic number 3, which is reclaiming the spaces of possibilities. So I was very lucky in the 90s to be involved in a movement called Reclaim the Streets. It began around 1995. And the whole idea of Reclaim the Streets was this idea of prefigurative politics. To create a politics that looks like the world that you want to create. So that every action in itself is a kind of image, a model, where you can feel or sense some of the possibilities of what the world that you want is, or could be like. So Reclaim Street started in 95. The idea was that streets are the commons. Does commons make any sense to people when I say the word commons? The street is a common. It's a common that's been privatised by urban development, but specifically privatised by shops and by cars. The car itself privatises the street, and if you look at a lot of sociology and urban studies, you can see that the more cars in the street, the less neighbourhood connections, the less people talk amongst themselves in the neighbourhood. And so the idea was to reclaim the street as a common, as a place where people could talk, as a place where people could live, as a place where people could create a sense of neighbourhoodness. So what we would do is we would normally meet we would use tactics from rave culture, so it was a real mixture of rave culture, anarchist culture, ecologist culture, and other social movements. And we would do what rave cultures did at the time, where you would meet in a point which was public, and then the actual street that we were going to reclaim was secret, and a few people knew. And we would basically take the metro, go down the metro, and in those days the police radios didn't work in the metro, and this was the first one. So what happened is on Camden High Street in North London, these two cars were kind of driving up the street, and suddenly the two cars crashed into each other, and people got out of the cars and started to shout, scream, and like road rage. What the fuck, you hit my car, da-da. And then one of them opened the boot of their car, and out of their car they brought hammers, and they started to attack their other car. And then the other person took out of their boot a load of paint and started throwing paint over their car. And at that moment, 500 people came out of the tube station, jumped on the cars, put the banner up, and of course they were our cars. It was a blockade to block the road from the traffic, and the street party happened. And the street party idea was really, politics has to be about pleasure. That, you know, as Recht knew, we can't change the world unless we make it the most pleasurable activity that we do. It has to be something that creates passionate desire in many ways. So the street party would be like a carnival. We'd be reclaiming the space, and we would do things like, a few years later, the street parties started to happen. They started to happen all over Europe, Berlin. There was some, I don't know, were there ever in Hamburg maybe? Yes, there was some in Hamburg. And so in London we started to get a bit over ambitious. We thought, shit, we've done streets, let's do a motorway. So we decided to do the shortest motorway in London, which is the M41, and this is after the government had already made rave music illegal in Britain. It was actually illegal to play rave music to more than 5 people in public. But they didn't stop us. So we took a motorway, 8,000 people took the motorway, and we covered the motorway in sand, so the children could play in the sand, as a sand pit, rather than being killed by the cars. And another thing on during this street party that we did is that we had these very large dresses, these kind of puppets that went up and down, and with real people at the top. Normally they had wigs on, but she's on the underpass, so she had to take her wig off. And they would move up and down, and every now and then they would stop by a sound system. And if you listen very carefully, you could hear a kind of rumble under the skirts. And what was happening is there were people under the skirts with jackhammers digging into the motorway and planting trees. And this taught me another great tactic, which was the importance of myth making. And again, artists are really brilliant at creating myths and creating stories. And the world changes through stories, more than facts, more than figures. It changes through telling good stories. And this story of the trees being planted in the motorway, it was 1997, I think. So it's early days of the internet, and it started to spread across the internet really, really rapidly. And managed to get people interested in very different movements, and was, in a sense, one of the beginnings of the coming together of the early days of the ultra-globalization movement, because we then got contacted by people like the Liverpool Dockers, who were like a trade union movement of dockers, very traditional left, who would normally never work with kind of anarchists and ravers and ecologists, and actually yet came together because of the imagination, because their imagination had been touched by this story, and they were like, wow, we want to work with these people. So again, it showed that imagination can really break down those boundaries. Okay, tactic number 4. Make the material your movement. No, make the material the... Oh, yeah, okay. I think I might have written that wrong. Anyway, make the material the movement. Let's go back a bit. 1871, Paris. It's the Commune. The Commune happens. The people of Paris, the kind of poor of Paris, the outcasts, organise, and they basically, together with kind of the class of journalists and so on, and they take back Paris, and they try and create the least representation possible. They try and create a city which is as directly democratic as possible. It terrifies the bourgeoisie, and many escape, especially the artists. So, Manet, Cézanne, Monet, what do? They don't stay in the Commune, they run away. They go to the suburbs, they go to the country, and they take refuge from the politics. But one artist stayed, Gustave Courbet, the kind of inventor of